72 degrees out right now.
That's
what I was checking the weather.
I wonder if that's okay for Jeff Rust. I wonder if 72 degrees is okay for Jeff.
I think that's called the definition of perfect.
I believe, what was it? Miss Congeniality, April.
Oh, yes. April. It was like April 25th or 28th.
April 28th is the perfect day. You can wear a light
The perfect
cardigan.
date. Yes.
Perfect date.
Yes.
You can wear a light cardigan. That's what Rust is looking for. That's the weather Rust is looking for right there.
Exactly. Right in my wheelhouse.
Oh, joining us now from ESPN. I don't know if I've ever seen him in a cardigan, but I could see old Kevin Pelton wearing a cardigan. You're a cardigan man,
rock
KP?
The hell out of a cardigan.
No, not a real big cardigan guy.
That's a little surprising. Seattle, I thought you'd like maybe channel a little Frasier vibes or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, but I don't even drink coffee, so I'm not a very good Northwesterner or Seattleite, that's for sure.
Well, hey, man, thanks for taking some time for us. The NBA lottery went down. The Portland Trailblazers fall back 3 spots. Explain why that's good, bad, or indifferent for a Portland team in this draft and then in their current phase of the rebuilding process.
I feel like, unless you were jumping into the top 1 or 2 picks, there might not be as big a difference as normal, moving down those handful of slots because, you keep hearing people say it. I was just listening to my ESPN colleague, Jonathan Gavotti, on the Low Post talking about it. This draft is very much in the eye of the beholder, and depending on how the Portland draft board looks, the guy that is available to at the top of the board at 7 might not be very different from the one who was available at the top of the board at 4. And so from that standpoint, it actually might not be such a bad thing because the rookie scale contract is a little lower when you go from 4 to 7.
As we've heard about this draft coming forward, and I think it is, I love that you said, because it's something we talked about yesterday, after 1 or 2, you kind of do have this kind of mush of players that are in a pack right there from 3 all the way down to 7. But with the Blazers holding 2 picks in this draft, 7 and the Warriors' 14th pick, are there players in this draft that you sit there and you go, all right, there's going to be value to be had 7 to 14? Because all we've heard about is top-end talent, not very good in this draft. What are we looking at from the depth between 7 and 14 and what the Blazers could potentially have?
My sense of it is that this draft is going to play out a bit more similarly to a draft that Blazers fans recall very fondly, which was the Brandon Roy LaMarcus Aldridge draft, and the one that it's often compared to, which is, the 2013 draft with Anthony Bennett, where there were superstars in that draft, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Rudy Gobert, and most notably, the CJ McCollum draft as well. But it was much more, towards the middle and even back end of the first round. It was that jumbled up. I think this might look more like that lottery with Roy and Aldridge, where there was kind of a grab bag, and a lot of people reached in, and even in the top 10, and drew out players who didn't end up having very notable careers, but the Blazers were able to come out of it somehow with 2 All-Stars. Now, I'm not saying that's the expectation, especially because, they ended up with much higher picks after they made moves up to get those than 7 and 14 as a starting point. But, I think there is talent here. It's just figuring out which of those guys are the talent is the question mark.
I liked it better when you said 2 All-Stars coming to Portland in one draft.
KP, you had a value chart, I think similar to the way the NFL does things when you're talking about value pick slotting. I think you originally debuted this in, was it like 2017, 2018, about basically what the number 1 overall pick value is as a scorer or points and then on down. That's for your typical NBA draft. How different is that comparatively, that scaling system, when you're looking at this class?
Yeah, that's a question that you've asked me in the Blazers media room, and it's still a tricky one to answer, I think, because I think there's probably, if you talk to people in the league, the answer might be a little different than mine, where I'm probably a little bit higher on the top end talent in this draft than most, and maybe lower on the certainty of even, unless it's a Wemby draft or a situation like that. And I think that's one of the challenges of doing this model in the NBA is that, it's so much more situational with the individual talent, whereas the NFL, I think, is more consistent because you're drafting, hundreds of players every year, that's going to wash out a little bit more from year to year than it is in the NBA, where one individual, it can have so much impact, and Wemby is so clearly a future superstar when he comes into the league. So the model I put together, it's kind of more similar to if you see the modern charts that base it on what the actual production is relative to your salary, as opposed to the traditional Jimmy Johnson chart that was, just kind of, well, let's understand what's actually going on when teams trade picks and base it off of that, then what the pick should be worth in a vacuum. I mean, I guess my answer is I'd probably discount it 10 to 15% compared to a usual number one pick. But then the issue is, some of those lower picks may be discounted a little bit too.
Mm-hmm. What is that? What is your chart as you're charting this out? And historically, at a place like 7, we went over this a little bit yesterday. Mm-hmm. The guys who've been picked at 7, there have been some great values that have been found there. There's also been some big swings and misses. Yeah, some Killian Hayes that have been in there. Historically, what do we kind of see around that 7 range?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the conclusion I'm sure you came to is, look, if you get somebody who's a solid starter, even if they're not an all-star caliber player in that range of the draft, you feel really good about that outcome, because that is certainly not guaranteed by the time you get probably outside of the top 4 or 5 picks. So, if it's somebody who's a role player but has a long career, that's a good outcome. Now, that's interesting, in the context of the idea of Portland already has some of those guys on the roster, and therefore does the idea become much more, let's go for the highest, upside outcomes, even if it's somebody who's maybe got a lower average outcome than someone else.
Kevin, when you look at the introduction of the new CBA coming in and being impactful this year, and the implications of first apron, second apron, and limits that it's going to put on teams, particularly a team at the very top of the draft, the Atlanta Hawks, they're in a position right now, their projected cap is going to prohibit them going forward, even though they have a lot of choices ahead of them, whether it's moving on from Clint Capella, moving on from Trae Young, or DeJounte Murray. Do you look at that? Because it's not just the Hawks. There's a number of teams really in the lottery that are in kind of the same position. As far as, do you expect that this draft period to be a more active than usual transaction period in the NBA as teams kind of line themselves up to kind of chase those windows within the CBA?
I do. I mean, I think, there's the financial element that you mentioned, the fact that a handful of teams control so many picks right now, not just this season. If you look at San Antonio having 2 of the top 10, but, going forward with all the picks that Oklahoma City and have Houston and has amassed and has, other teams picks, those sorts of things. I think that plays to more trades. And then the other element of it is to go back to the eye of the beholder. If you believe that, Houston is maybe a bad example now because they ended up in the 3rd pick. But let's say they were down still in the 10 range, but they thought that Reed Shepherd was a top 3 player in this draft and no one else did. They're motivated to go up and get him in a way that another team might not be. So, now that they're at 3, they have the opportunity to just take him. But there's going to be someone else like that where, just all it takes is one team to believe that this is, actually a top 3 guy who slid to, say Portland's 7th pick or, the 5th pick. And suddenly it starts packaging more than you would expect normally in that spot because they think it's someone who has fallen below where their range should be.
How do you feel Portland and Joe Cronin and his staff, the front office, have done in positioning Portland to be active in all of this changes that we could see over this offseason leading up to the draft? Because Neil O'Shea kind of backed himself into a corner and the franchise into a corner with the contracts, and it's been untangling of that for Joe Cronin. Where are they positioned heading into this offseason, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's a good description of it. So, having multiple picks, 2 picks at the top of the 2nd round, it gives you a lot of options. It presents some challenges in terms of fitting everyone into this roster because so many guys are going to be coming back from last season. But that's a good problem to have if you have too many players that belong on an NBA roster. The one downside is, the way that the Damian Lillard trade and those subsequent trades broke out, they don't necessarily have that financial flexibility to take advantage if teams are really looking to shed salary because of the second apron rules that are coming in. They're not in position to help those teams out without going into the tax themselves. So, it'd be interesting to see how good would a move have to be if it adds to the payroll to, get Jody Allen to sign off on potentially paying the luxury tax for a team that you know absolutely is not going to be good enough to justify it, but maybe there is some benefit down the road.
Kevin, when you look at this organization right now, we ran a poll earlier today. What is the single biggest thing that needs to take place for this organization to get back on track? And your options were getting that superstar player, getting a new front office, getting a new coach, getting a new owner. We both have where we landed on this, and I have a real suspicion of where you're going to land on this. But what is the thing that changes everything?
So I would say unless you have the superstar player, the answer is always getting the superstar player, because that is just the singular factor that matters the most in the NBA over the long term. And, I think we're on the same page in terms of I don't think there's any reason to put the Blazers' position right now at the feet of Joe Cronin or Jody Allen or anybody else. It's just a product of, and I don't even know that I would necessarily blame Neil Olshey. That's what you do when you have a Damian Lillard in the prime of his career, is you try to do everything you can to win. And one of the challenges we're seeing a number of teams face is that teams are digging themselves into increasingly deeper holes in kind of the pursuit of winning on the timelines of their stars. Phoenix with Kevin Durant, the Lakers with LeBron James. So to some degree, the Blazers probably do deserve credit that other than the one, Chicago protected pick that's out there and is going to eventually affect them if they ever get out of the lottery, like they don't have a lot. They have their own picks. They're able to rebuild, but they haven't yet converted one of those into that superstar player. And until you have that player, it's really hard to kind of take that next step in a rebuild.
I want to revisit something you were talking about with the draft a little bit really quick here. Is you said that every team kind of has different evaluations on different players. And this year it gets a little bit more muddy because it's not as clear cut, and some team may covet one player's skill set than another. When are we going to learn about this as far as the process goes on? Because out of the combine and after the lottery, when everybody knows where they're picking, we start to hear those rumblings. But is this going to drag on a little bit longer? And are we going to maybe look at with more detail which players are being brought in to different organizations for the pre-draft workouts and try to find out who these franchises are coveting in the draft?
Yeah, that will be interesting, although obviously you can also manipulate that if you're a team and take advantage of the fact that people are reading into it. I mean, the other element of it, again, is the trade piece. So, if you're thinking at 7, these are the 3 players we're going to, be choosing between basically, at that spot. And then someone comes up ahead of you and they like one of those 3 players more than the team that moved out of that spot, then that throws off the process again. So I think, I do think 2013 is a good comparison from that standpoint where, look, none of us even knew who Cleveland was going to take at number 1 until they took Anthony Bennett. It was a truly shocking development, and it set a bunch of other things in motion. Most notably the New Orleans Pelicans trading the number 6 pick, I think it was, to Philadelphia along with a future pick for Drew Holiday, a move that ended up kind of fascinating tentacles for both of those organizations. It was really the start of the process in Philadelphia, trading away a young guy who had just been an all-star to get Noel, who we thought was going to be the number 1 pick in the draft and was still out there much lower than expected. And then New Orleans, in terms of, how that eventually compromised their ability to put young talent around Anthony Davis, but then set them up to trade Drew Holiday for a bunch of stuff way down the road too. So, I think those are the kind of moves we could see this year.
Kevin, thanks for your time, man. I appreciate you. I'd say I'll get you down here for something, but you don't have any reason to be down here anytime soon.
Yeah, that's why we need the WNBA expansion team in Portland. We need to get that going.
Get a little I-5
reason for me to be down there in the summer.
There you go, a little I-5 rivalry. All right, Kev, again, thanks for taking the time, man. We'll check back in probably around draft time.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks, man. Appreciate you. That's Kevin Pelton of ESPN, covers the NBA and WNBA. KP, all-around great dude and incredibly insightful and knowledgeable, particularly on the value scaling analytics throughout the NBA.
That was really interesting stuff, the way that he values this draft. Mm-hmm. He said 10 to 15% downgrade on the number 1 overall pick, but then kind of everything else, it
slots around.
It slots around it, but it's not this draft is it's a little wonky.
I
It's a
like how
little
he
different.
placed that as the grab bag. That actually makes a lot of sense because you're going to reach in. Like, everybody remembers LaMarcus and Brandon from that draft, and they forget that Andrea Bargnani was the number 1 overall pick.
Yeah.
Like, that's just, and Bargs had a couple of good seasons, but I mean, he cratered because he fell on his face when he went to New York. But if the Blazers are able to pull out like relatively good starters from this draft, be pretty impressive.
Well, and like, look at it in this terms. 06, Bargnani went 1, LA went 2, Adam Morrison was 3rd.
That's the other one everybody forgets because Tyrese Thomas went 4.
Draft the stash. Tyrese Thomas, which is the reason why the Blazers got LA.
They traded him and Victor Kriapa for LaMarcus.
And then you also had Shaden Williams go right before B. Roy at 6. But then you go down in that 7 range. Randy Foye was right behind Brandon.
That's who swapped for, yep.
Swapped. And then a guy at 8 in that draft who was serviceable, played a hell of a long time in the NBA, was Rudy Gay. And that's what Pelton was saying, is that you look at this draft and it's like, superstar-wise,
Rudy Gay doesn't have the injury. Like, his career is even more impressive.
Rudy Gay
was a
had
really
a
good
really long career and was a solid starter in the league, and that's kind of what he's saying that we need to look at here. Other guys in that draft that played a really long time and had roles. J.J. Redick went 11th overall, right? Just a shooter. That's about it. Just shoot. Rajon Rondo went 21st overall. Kyle Lowry, 24th overall. Shannon Brown, who played seemingly forever. Shannon Brown played forever. I didn't know he was drafted in I forgot he was drafted in 06. But a guy that played a really long time in the NBA, and that's kind of what Pelton is saying, is that it's not going to be the top-heavy superstar, multi-time all-stars through and through, likely, but there could be value when you're sitting there saying you want a lot of guys that can play a long time. The only problem with that with Portland, as he noted, and we've talked about at length, there's a lot of those guys kind of on the Blazers roster right now, right? Like, Toumani Camara projects to be a guy who plays in the NBA for several years and is a solid role player.
Yeah.
Like, not probably never going to make an all-star team, right?
But if you were able to pair him with a Rudy Gay type, because again, I love Toumani.
I love him too.
I love Toumani. But
and
what if,
I love Ryan.
And I'm not saying that whoever they draft is going to be Rudy Gay. But I'm just like, this is the perspective of it, and kind of what Kevin was talking about is at least my understanding was where he was going. Rudy Gay, people like, oh, he was washed or whatever. Rudy Gay in his prime was basically 18, 19, 20, 6, and 3. You're telling me this team wouldn't love to have a 6'8" forward capable of getting you 18, 6, and 3?
I'm good.
On like 45, 36, 80? Like,
give me another guard.
But what you hope you don't get is Patrick O'Brien. Who was also in that draft, and he went 8th overall. Or 9th overall, right after Rudy Gay. He went 9th overall in that 2006 draft. There's going to be guys like that. You just got to hope that the evaluations hit, and you get the right guy. And we shall see. TBD.